Good morning, everyone. My name is meteorologist Hunter Fawkes, and today is December 28th, 2024. And today we have a potentially potent severe weather day on tap. Currently, the Storm Prediction Center in Norman has issued a level 4 out of 5 risk, a moderate risk for severe thunderstorms, all hazard risks, including tornadoes over the deep south, which includes far east Texas, northern Louisiana, central and southern portions of Mississippi and western portions of Alabama. As we can see, the moderate risk currently is over northern Louisiana and most of central and southern Mississippi, with a little bit nosing into Alabama and on the west side a bit into Texas. Currently, a 10 to 15% hatch risk exists for potentially several tornadoes and a few strong to long track tornadoes, particularly focused over those enhanced and moderate risk areas over the southern portions of the United States. Accompanying that as well is a hatch risk area for severe wind, particularly wind gusts 60 to 70 miles per hour in that red and hatched regions of the South, along with a general broad risk of 15% chance of large hail impacting places like the Texas, Dallas-Fort Worth area, all along the western southern coast regions of the United States. So currently, what we have going on across here, we already have a bit of activity going on in the portions of the south. As we can see, numerous showers and thunderstorms are already ongoing, particularly one severe storm here with actually starting to look a little bit like we might have our first tornado producer of the day. We'll have to watch this as the day progresses. But we have lots of showers and thunderstorms across the northern portion of the risk area. Um, Looking back west towards more of the cold front area, we see that there are starting to see showers and thunderstorms develop, along with potentially a confluence band starting to fire some lead precipitation showers and thunderstorms as well. So, with it already being 10:26 in the morning out there Central Time, we're already starting to see things getting going, which is pretty typical of these Dixie weather events. So looking now at some satellite, we can get a lot of important details here. First thing we note already is the numerous showers and thunderstorms that are ongoing here across portions of the northern risk area. We can see a big complex of thunderstorms here and more scattered showers and thunderstorms out here across the northern portions of the area. It'll be hard to try to destabilize any further than these, as these are likely leaving outflow boundaries in the region. So we can honestly denote some features here, just even from the satellite picture, and get a loop running here. We can see that a outflow boundary of storms seems to be kind of initiating right along here with an arc that is generating showers and thunderstorms out here towards the Gulf Coast. And we see probably likely a cold front extending out here. So regardless of the ongoing showers and thunderstorms, we do see a rather large warm sector expanding here from central southeast Texas all the way through into nosing into Mississippi already. So while the cold front is more out west, out this way, we do see that there is already a really wide breadth in this warm sector. And as we can see already, lots of really strong streamers moving northward with time. And we're starting to even see breaks in the cloud cover, especially out here over the Houston area and along the Gulf Coast, allowing for a lot of heating and warming as we get into going into the afternoon, or excuse me, late morning into the afternoon. So I don't see too much issue with this warm sector as we go on, due to part to the fact that while we are having partly cloudy skies over most of the warm sector, we do see that there is pockets of clearing and areas where sunshine is able to reach the surface in here, and this is only going to advect northward with time. So unfortunately for those in this region, it does look like instability will be able to build and move in off of the Gulf Coast and allow for robust instability to build more closer to the Gulf Coast, but allow some instability to make its way northward, even seeing some clearing out here into portions of Louisiana as well. So a little bit of a concerning situation. We were worried that for storm chasers and meteorologists, we were, concerned about what this whole warm sector would kind of look like. But it seems rather unmuddied by the ongoing convection as the storms and convection are ongoing outside or on the leading edges of the warm sector itself. Now, I do see one interesting point I want to point out here on satellite as well is the moderate risk does extend, as we discussed earlier, into portions of Alabama and Mississippi as well. But we do see lots of cloud cover and storms ongoing at the moment. Now, I'm not too concerned about this because while there is a lot of heavy cloud cover over the region and likely not a whole lot of destabilization that's able to occur there, and storms that are over here are likely elevated as they're running over the boundary. Um, we'll see this warm sector shift eastward and northeastward with time. So this warm sector should be allowed. I mean, this is getting messy, excuse me. Let me remove this. This warm sector should advect more like this with time. So while this area seems like a little destable, not very destabilized and heavy in cloud cover, watch out for rapid recovery in this region as the warm sector advects east, as our low pressure system and storm system moves off to the east northeast with time. So let's look at some surface data here. Let's clear all this. Excuse me. There we go. And what we see here, and I'll actually pull up a hand analysis that I did this morning. What we can see here is our current low pressure is stationed out here west of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, denoted in this low section over here, and roughly around a central pressure of 1,006 millibars. So we do see some semblance of cyclogenesis ongoing here over Texas. We see that our cold front extends down here out into west central Texas. And our warm fronts, and a key feature that I noticed when making this map this morning was while on satellite, it seemed like the warm sector was fairly confined to this section here, which we can see denoted by a trough line that I drew. We can see plenty of dews in here that are substantial for severe weather. We see upper 60s, we see low 70 dew points making their way inland. Lots of 70 dew points actually, and all in this region here. We see that these dew points are making their way northward, and we see temperatures warming into the mid 70s, especially here down across the more southern Gulf states, or portion of the Gulf states here. But important thing to note that the synoptic warm front is extended along pressure tongue out here across southern Arkansas and northern Mississippi. So this led to me to believe that while there is a lot of heavy cloud cover over here from ongoing thunderstorms and this reinforced outflow boundary is stalling or not allowing rapid destabilization of the atmosphere up there, due to wind vectors allowing warm air to continue to be pulled off the Gulf, even though it is on the cooler side, this should allow this warm air to continue to pull northward into the region and allow parts of northern and central Mississippi and northern Louisiana to be able to stabilize. And a little bit of a concerning thing is that these winds are allowed to be fairly backed um, on the other side of this reinforced outflow boundary. That will allow for larger uh, SRH to build on this side of the boundary. And if this side of the boundary can destabilize, this zone will become a very favorable area for strong long track tornadoes, as it'll be a shear boundary and an instability gradient for these storms later in the day as they progress eastward. So we'll need to watch this key zone here, where this ends up. This will probably, with time, become more east to west bound, and maybe it'll even completely fade out as the atmosphere starts to destabilize on the northern side of the boundary. But we'll definitely need to watch where this boundary goes, because I think this will become a key feature for where strong to potentially long track cyclic supercells and tornadoes will occur with time. Other key features I just want to point out as well is, again, do notice that while this area up here is a little bit on the cooler side, extremely backed winds here will likely lead to a all hazards QLCS threat. through the afternoon and especially into the overnight hours in northern Mississippi as well. I think this will be end up being a fairly sleeper target, and I expect a few tornadoes as the cold front makes its way eastward with time. I do expect a few tornadoes out here in this northern region as the area destabilizes um, with time. So let's also go take a look at how we're doing overall with the environment itself. So let's look at some 12Z soundings here, and we'll zoom out here, make this a little less blurry. So starting out here, we're going to begin out here in far south Texas. What we see is about a kilometer deep of a boundary layer with some semblance of an EML. And this makes sense as we saw from the satellite picture. We see lots of high cloud cover does not exist over the open Gulf of Mexico and far southern Texas, meaning while there isn't a very strong cap in place, there is something. And likely it's already eroded out here, probably from about this point northward. But there is some semblance of an EML advecting in this way, because we all we have is low level cloud cover and then the ongoing thunderstorms as well. And actually, this confluence band has got me interested um, as it's developed over the last hour or so. So we'll dive into that shortly. Um, but going back here into soundings, we see plenty of potential instability here. Dry layer aloft, a little bit of a nose. Looks like a decent loaded gun sounding here in far south Texas. Moving up here a little further, we see that continue about a kilometer deep boundary layer, some dry air aloft in the mid levels of the atmosphere, and lots of potential instability ready to rock and roll. But notice as we started to go more northward and we start seeing a little bit more of that wind field change, we start seeing a little bit longer extension of a photograph, but we do start to see the low-level advection regime is going quite strong down here, allowing large low-level turning of the atmosphere and favorable photograph for supercells and tornadoes here, with 0 to 1 kilometer reaching a little over 150, 0 to 1, and 0 to 3 kilometer reaching almost 300 here. A very favorable profile for rotating storms, organizing themselves into supercells later. Looking further along the coast of Lake Charles, we see that semblance of that EML is completely removed here. So likely our EML that may end up playing a role later today has not quite made its way to the more eastern portions of the warm sector. As we see, we're already entirely uncapped. Likely all we need is a little bit of low-level convergence to kick off any storms, which already seems to be the case with lots of storms riding out here in East Texas and northern Louisiana. But a large level of instability, and particularly in this lowest 3 kilometers of the atmosphere, we see a large value of CAPE here. And actually, looking here as well, we see three CAPE values of already over 150 joules per kilogram in this 3 kilometer layer at 12Z or 6 a.m. in this region, which is a extremely large level of instability, which is also denoted by a very deep boundary layer, over 2 kilometers deep, pushing probably 2.5 kilometers deep before we see a little bit of a kink and warming before we start rising, indicating that this is a very soupy atmosphere, but a very destabilized atmosphere. Photographs themselves look favorable for supercells themselves, as we start seeing still 150 0 to 1, which is sufficient for producing supercells and tornadoes, and a little bit less in the 3 kilometer layer. But overall, the photograph is fairly longer, um, with a little bit of a low level shear available. So this would likely favor, at least as we go through the morning and we see this low level shear decrease through the diurnal cycle and winds start to veer with surface heating. These will likely be more favorable for hailers through the morning unless these backed surface wind fields can maintain through the atmosphere through the late morning and early afternoon. And likely that's more likely to occur out here over the eastern portions of the risk area than over Texas, as winds are already starting to veer themselves. Not too aggressive from Dallas Fort Worth, as the front never made it there and they've been socked in rain showers. And looking out here over Shreveport, we do see that while they are on the cool side of the surface boundary, notice that about a kilometer and a half above the ground, they are very ready and destabilized, waiting for the opportunity to use this instability. And as we saw this morning already, there are ongoing thunderstorms in the region. So likely the warm sector was able to advance that far northward. Looking here at New Orleans, same story, very deep. Um, uh, Moisture layer up to 6 kilometers deep, just absolutely saturated out here. So we're able to maintain some level of instability out here. But again, they are likely on the cool side of the outflow boundary, which has not allowed them to destabilize at least through 12Z this morning. Looking up here into Mississippi, we see a similar story as New Orleans, but we do see some dry air aloft, and that was pretty easy to tell from the satellite picture that outside of high cirrus, there is some dry air aloft, which is leading to some level of instability aloft here. Um, so overall, it seems like we're dealing with a fairly classic Dixie type of setup with some semblance of a very weak EML advecting over the Northern Gulf, likely at this time, as of recording this at 10:40 a.m. Central Time. So we'll have to see how this weak EML makes its way into Louisiana with time, and see if that plays any role with keeping over convection kind of at bay, or are we able to just fully convect the environment, which would turn it more into a squalline linear system rather than discrete bubblers out ahead of the cold front themselves. But there is some semblance of a robust severe weather threat this morning. So now we are going to go take a look at how things are behaving with height. So here at 850, we see, if I can pull up the right one, here we go. We see that there already is maintaining a low-level jet here with peaking out at 40 knots, generally area of 35 knots from the southwest, 35 to 40 knots. Plenty of low-level jet. I expect this to weaken as we go through the early afternoon hours with the diurnal cycle, but with the deepening low, we should be able to maintain some low-level jet. It won't completely disappear. We'll likely maintain 30 to 35 knots until we start going towards the late afternoon and we start to decouple the surface, and we should start seeing this low-level jet ramp up overnight. And that seems to be the case as we progress through here. We see that low-level jets start to ramp up and see a lot wider area of 40 knot, 850 millibar winds right off the deck as well. So plenty of strong low-level wind shear should be able to maintain through the day. But I do think we'll see more of a hail threat to begin with, moving into a tornado threat overnight. Looking here at 700 millibars, we see a couple of key features. We see uh, right here, we see our shortwave. Oh, excuse me. Drawing lines and not there we go. So we see our shortwave here has moved through and honestly pretty anchored with the um, outflow reinforced warm front, we'll call it, through the area. So this has led to a lot of showers and thunderstorms in this region here ahead of the warm sector. So this likely hasn't had too much of a dampening effect overall, just stunted the overall warm front progression, warm sector progression, excuse me, to this point. But we do also see that while we have our cold front that is draped out this way, we're seeing a lot more parallel flow to that boundary as well, which has allowed for a lot of precipitation. This is getting messy, excuse me. We're starting to see a lot of precipitation form on the cool side of this boundary, forming more of linear segments in here with this passing shortwave. So this has led to a little bit of an earlier start to the severe weather threat. But overall, these things are kind of on the northern fringe of the overall warm sector. So I don't think these things are going to have too much of a dampening effect, besides just leaving trailed outflow boundaries for storms later this evening. And we do also see our main player of the day, our overall large open wave trough here. We're seeing a little bit of a semblance of it trying to close off, but for the most part, it's pretty much this big open wave that is pretty neutrally aligned at this point. So neither positive nor negative. Um, but we're kind of going through the maturing stage of the trough, at least here at 700 millibars. So as we see this swing through, we should start seeing a lot more discrete elements, and we're already seeing a little bit of that as we're getting into some lift here at 700 millibars and a bit of a confluence band here. Starting to see some lift, generating showers and thunderstorms along the cold front and this boundary as well. Let's move up to, oh, wait, one more thing I wanted to also mention. Um, is this, as I mentioned, this potential EML from southern Texas. Notice where this is aligned to go. We see the 6 degrees Celsius contour has nosed its way up into southwest Louisiana, just offshore. And all of this flow is just bringing this warmer, slightly drier air at 700 millibars up this way. And this might just be enough to keep the southern portions of the warm sector uncapped, uh, aside from any boundaries which may form. But this may generate a nice thermal ridge here at 700 millibars. And if we can get discrete elements to form from confluence bands from subtle lift, that might be enough to generate more isolated convection rather than just an ongoing slew of precipitation and linear mode. So interesting little feature here as we go into the late morning hours. Seems like there is some drier air moving into the region. Not much, but just enough. That might just keep things at bay in the warm sector itself. Now let's move up to 500 millibars, and we see a very important feature that was pretty debated in model land was the timing of this jet streak moving through the region. We can see a really nice jet streak rounding the base at 500 millibars, with the core itself being right over here at 80 knots at 500 millibars. And also to note, a very cold center at 500, which is getting towards minus 23 degrees Celsius. So a lot of cold air allowing for robust instability development and some jet dynamics here. Uh, there was a lot of debate in Model Land of whether this was going to be a lot more held back. Was it already going to be ejecting through by this point? Um, or something kind of in the middle. And it seems we got more of a middle solution where this jet axis is really starting to rotate through the base of the trough, signaling that this trough, at least at 500 millibars, is nearing maturity, which is kind of bad news if you don't want severe weather, because this will advect to the east and northeast, and we already see a little bit of diffluence aloft with the spreading of these wind vectors here, allowing for lift over our warm sector. And while this jet axis has not fully reached the warm sector itself, some influence is already being made known, and we're starting to see synoptic scale lift for ascent out here across eastern Texas, which is again heavily favoring this little confluence band, which is already beginning to produce showers and thunderstorms well out ahead of the cold front itself. So we'll need to watch this. But it seems like the timing of this jet at 500 millibars will be favorably timed with peak heating, which should allow a robust um, ability for showers and thunderstorms and supercells across East Texas into southern and central Louisiana through the afternoon. So a little bit of a concerning trend is that left exit region starts to kind of impinge upon the region. So very interesting that we saw in Model Land. This was a pretty heavily debated, and we seemed we got closer to the ceiling when it comes to where this jet was going to end up being placed. But continuing on here, let's look at 300 millibars for any jets themselves, is where we really do jet dynamics. And we see that, and let's change our color due to a lot of already pinks. We'll do yellow. We see that there is stronger flow held out back here behind the overall open wave, but we are still seeing an attempt to close off this circulation, but it is still maintaining an open wave. But we see that there is a jet back here with maybe two maxima here and here, but we are also seeing at the lead of the trough a zone of about 80 knots of 300 millibar flow, allowing for pretty robust lift over the right entrance and left exit regions. Let's clear this because this is getting a little messy again. Um, and so what we're seeing, well, that was terrible, excuse me. We are starting to see lift over the right exit region, allowing for this confluence band to really take advantage of some synoptic scale lift. These will probably be a pretty big concern for tornadoes through the initial portion of the day, as this is a synoptically favored region to produce rotating supercells and potentially tornadoes as we kind of dug through the atmosphere slice by slice. Seems like this left exit region is probably going to continue to eject out this way, and we're looking more for this right entrance region to move into our rest of our warm sector, which does align with our current moderate risk area and our potential boundary, as well as it lifts northward to create a potentially volatile situation for tornadoes. And we'll have to kind of watch as this moves to the northeast with time. So, with that being said, that seems to be kind of where we are as the atmosphere as is. So, let's take a look at some models and see how they're handling the current state of the atmosphere. So, we're going to look at the 15Z HER and we're going to do it slice by slice, working our way top to bottom. And let's see how the model handles what's going on. It seems to initialize that 500 millibar jet streak really nicely, rounding the very left base of the trough itself. And we see that progression slide in, and by 20Z, or I believe this is 2 p.m., it's already starting to gain slightly more negatively tilted behavior and starting to really push. Yeah, especially here as we go towards 5 p.m. Trough is really starting to try to dig negatively tilted here and close off a bit. And we see lots of strong flow is now being ejected out over the wide warm sector. Kind of a concerning trend here. 700 millibars, we see our shortwave is moving through and some flow underneath it. But we see as we continue on, as our cyclone develops here at 700 millibars and deepens, we see an explosion of strong wind fields, pulling that potentially drier air into the warm sector and over land off the Gulf, and allowing for stronger wind shears themselves. I expect photographs to really start lengthening by 2, 3 p.m. as we move towards the evening, and then just deepening of this low itself should allow for lots of flow to really elongate those photographs, giving some classic Dixie shapes. But this is a lot of really strong flow to have at 700 millibars. At 850, we should see the same thing as the low deepens. We start seeing an explosion of the low level jet. And this seems to be timing peak heating pretty well here. This is about 3 p.m. Um, so we haven't quite hit the evening. Man, the sun's kind of going down at this point. Um, so we start seeing diurnal effects start to wane and the low level jets start to expand. And with the deepening low level or deepening low at 850 should allow for the low level jet to absolutely just crank here. Look at this, by 6 p.m. we're dealing with 60 knots of low level jet over all of Mississippi and ahead into Louisiana as well. A little bit more veered out of the southwest here at 850. Might be a bit of a problem if the surface continues to be veered. So we'll have to check that out. But it seems like from the due south, it's almost 50 to 60 knots and just a very classic Dixie low-level jet that we have going on here. 700 millibars at temperature, we want to look at this. We do see that while the low does come plowing in, we do start seeing a little bit of warmth just out ahead of it being pulled off of that from southern Texas into the warm sector. And it's not much. This is still pretty cold at 700 millibars, but it is winter. So we got to keep in mind that this might just be enough to keep the open warm sector ahead of the cold front fairly unmuted by ongoing storms. We might see a storm or two, and those would be very dangerous for an all hazards threat. We don't need to, I don't think we need to look at this as well. So let's move down to the surface. Let's see how our wind field itself begins to behave. So at 15Z, we see a little bit of a southwest here and more southerlies out here in more eastern Texas. We see a warm front, really easy to see here, um, being draped through here, but we do see that there is the reinforced boundary right through here. So seems like the 15Z HER itself is really initialized quite well with the cold front itself extending out this way. So you see plenty of warmth coming out of the Gulf here, and surface boundaries seem to be pretty well set. For me, I think the 15Z HER is generally the most accurate model run of the HER, as it has enough time to initialize the morning conditions, initial conditions, and have enough time to model out the afternoon. So we see as we go towards lunch hour, we see lots of showers and thunderstorms over northern Texas. The cold front is starting to advance eastward, and we still see southerlies almost even backing a little more out of the east as we continue on, especially out here. Southeasterlies continue over Mississippi, but we are warming a little bit towards 70. Moving towards 3 p.m., we still maintain stronger flow out here in Louisiana out of the south, and we still maintain this backed easterly flow, but not able to warm all that much. So that would definitely stunt instability as we go towards the evening. And we see our cold fronters really plowing in with convection likely, but we still continue to see flow out of the southeast here across northern Mississippi. So the instability overall might be lower, but the fact that we're stable to maintain these back to southeasterlies, excuse me, would likely lead to a continuation of the tornado threat despite reduced instability. But down here, a little further south, where we've been able to maintain a little bit more heating towards now 5, 6 p.m., temperatures near 70, upper 60s to near 70, we see that this would likely be a pretty favorable region for tornadic activity. Probably a little bit more of a QLCS or broken embedded supercell line. Unclear if we're going to be able to actually maintain a confluence band in here. It seems like the flow is pretty uniform. So it'd be pretty hard to get subtle enough forcing to generate in the warm sector itself. But this wind field is pretty concerning for how strong it is out of the southeast. It looks like 10 to 15 knots, uh, potentially pushing 20 maybe in some places. So very strong surface flow here. And as we move into the evening, we continue to see this warm sector not really weaken all that much. Temperatures still maintaining in the upper 60s themselves with back southeasterlies. So I would expect a tornado threat across here. And actually, you can see the bow across this northern section of the bow, probably of QLCS linear mode, to see kinks in the line producing very brief, potentially strong, fast-moving tornadoes here across northern Mississippi well after dark, as this is now 9 p.m. Central Time. As we continue on, we see that warm sector still continue to plow through into western and northern Alabama, all the way down through back into Louisiana, where surface winds are really starting to veer out of the southwest. So I think the tornado threat would probably be over for New Orleans, which is a great thing. But probably not zero, but lesser, which is what we'd like to see, but still a maintaining tornado threat well into the evening hours. So looking now at surface dew points, which is really important for these Dixie events, we see these 70 dew points really creep northward into the delta, and we see these back southeasterlies continue to pull moisture northward, excuse me, and not allow for this area to really cool off due to consistent advection of this moisture. So while temperatures might not be very impressive, in my personal experience, when we have these situations of a warm sector that can't cool off and be able to decouple from the surface, and we start ramping up the wind shear, this is when we start getting into the classic Dixie events where you have just enough instability, probably only need 800 to 1,000 joules of surface-based CAPE to make it work. But if you combine this with 200 to 300 0 to 1 SRH, we might be in a situation for some trouble, and we'll take a look at that. And we see that warm sector continue to plow through as our low lifts off to the northeast into the Ohio River Valley overnight. So let's take a look at how the HER model is handling reflectivities as is. So we see plenty of convection, although the HER seems to really develop a lot of more convection than I think is actually there. That seems pretty on point. And actually, while in the recording of this video, since we have a tornado warning with a funnel cloud report here northwest of Houston, So an interesting thing to point out in the live video, but actually seems to be developing this precipitation over the northern warm sector pretty well in making this video. So it seems like the 15Z HERT is doing quite well with initialization. So as we go on, we'll see the HERT seems to develop a lot of showers and thunderstorms. This seems a little overblown compared to what the overall warm sector looks like, but still notice that we do still maintain a fairly undisturbed warm sector and maybe even nosing more this way. Undisturbed warm sector with maybe a few bubblers out here in eastern Louisiana and southwest Mississippi. So we'll need to kind of watch that as we go on, as these any storms out ahead of the cold fronts themselves and any bubblers out ahead would likely have a more robust potential of a tornado. Yeah, and we continue to see just a very classic uh, northeast to southwest orientated front line, which is always a notorious Dixie tornado killing day type of setup. So I do believe that any storms that generally form along this boundary throughout the late afternoon will probably be struggling to produce tornadoes themselves, probably more of a damaging wind threat. But notice there is still lots of beans and bubblers well out ahead of this. And as these guys rocket northward and collide with excuse me, this is getting cluttered again. As these guys move northward with time, and actually let's choose a better color. As these storms move northward with time, and collide with the line itself, that may generate shear zones where you may get quick little spin ups as a supercell merges with the line, getting a bit of a merging effect, as we learned from Dr. Cameron Nixon, that we might see the ability of these storms as they collide with this line to produce sudden tornado genesis if they're not able to perform that process well out in the open warm sector ahead of the line itself. So, let's pull some soundings here as we see the progression. We see that bow echo really start to amplify, kind of getting more of that classic S shape where we start seeing lots of bubblers out ahead in Mississippi and the line itself really starting to kind of back more northwest to southeast. This would lead to lots of QLCS circulations and even kinks in the line being modeled here in the HER itself. So I would expect a fairly robust tornado threat to continue through the evening hours as we continue on through the night, as we get into Alabama. And then surface winds start to veer out of the southwest, so likely ending the tornado threat as the northern section also runs out of the instability axis. So it seems like we're in for a pretty long night tonight. So let's pull some soundings here. We'll look back here at surface dew points. So here by 18Z, we'll pull a sounding here out of East Texas here ahead of the veered winds, and we see still rather straight hodograph. We're still seeing large low-level SRH, but the inability to really heat the surface, I think, is really going to hold back maybe the northern mode from producing tornadoes. They'll be surface-based, but barely. And I'd be a little concerned about getting any robust tornado threat on the northern area of the warm sector. Let's pull one a little more south here. Yeah, and there we go. We're starting to see much more directional shear here, and a little bit shorter of a hodograph, so likely favoring maybe a little bit smaller to average size discrete storms. But we see a very deep boundary layer over a kilometer deep, a little bit of resemblance of some drier air working aloft and getting some better lapse rates aloft, allowing for more robust instability. But keep in mind, we are still seeing very large instability in the 3 kilometer layer, which would favor a much more robust low level response from supercells. And combine that with very streamwise 0 to 1 kilometer um, regions of the hodograph, this would potentially lead to a tornado threat as early as 18Z in the southern portions of the risk area if we're able to maintain convection in the open warm sector. Let's continue on towards 21Z, and we start to see that the low itself is really starting to advance northward or eastward and northeastward, and our moisture is really starting to pull. So let's pull a sounding here in northern Louisiana. Take a look at this. And we're starting to see more curvature in the hodograph itself, still maintaining 200, 0 to 1 SRH. And again, very streamwise as well in the 0 to 2 kilometer, about 0 to 1 kilometer area with enough instability, very saturated profile. So I would expect more of a QLCS type event to take more advantage of the low level wind shear at this point. Um, Not a lot of dry air out here. I'm probably getting close to some uh, rain showers as we're getting a lot of subsidence here. Um, but very deep moisture all the way through, very saturated profile with lots of wind shear. Let's move a little more south into the southern portions of the delta, and we see a very impressive hodograph shape. We see extremely streamwise, arguably up to 2 kilometers, maybe even to 3 kilometers. But focusing on that 0 to 1, very streamwise layer, we start seeing some dry air aloft above 2 kilometers. And actually, in the sounding, we see dew point is warmer than temperature. So let's actually take a different sounding, as that's not realistic. That's better. And we see, again, the maintaining of this low level instability, low LCLs, and streamlined 0 to 1s um, kilometer areas of the hodograph are really continuing to maintain this robust tornado threat um, through the afternoon, especially in the more southern portions of the warm sector, as we're seeing more backed wind fields out here. Continuing on, let's take a look at Mississippi here, and we see while there is very marginal instability, it is unstable enough. And notice the magnitude of this low-level wind shear through 2 kilometers, three, arguably all the way through 6 kilometers, extremely streamwise for the most part, and just enough instability. This is a very concerning sign. If we're able to get some real instability into this region, this would favor a very strong tornado threat despite limited instability, because in these events, you often just need enough instability to allow parcels to rise. And in this wind shear and a very forced regime, a QLCS strong tornado threat can be very easily realized here. Let's continue now towards 0Z, and we see now that we have maintained back southeasterlies. And let's take a look out here. We'll start from south to north and deeper of the warm sector. Winds are a little bit more veered out of the southwest. We really bunched up hodograph. Some semblance of strong low-level shear. I mean, we're still maintaining 200, 0 to 1 SRH, and 3 Cape is still very strong. So maybe we still maintain some semblance of a conditional tornado threat down here. Um, Instability is looking great. The overall clunky hodograph shape would likely lead to very messy storms, lots of mergers, precipitation everywhere, very HP mode. But the overall low-level wind shear should maintain a tornado threat, at least through 0Z here in western Louisiana. Let's go now here into the center of the moderate risk area in Mississippi, and we see a very impressive hodograph shape, very large 0 to 1 SRH. I mean, we're pushing 400 0 to 1 SRH. Very low LCLs, still plenty instability. We've got at least 1,200 joules per kilogram of surface-based cape, and mixed layer cape still running at 1,300, so plenty of instability. This would be favorable for a robust embedded supercell QLCS strong tornado threat with this sounding here. And very fast moving too, 45 knots, maybe for Dixie standards. Uh, maybe not too fast for Dixie standards, but still fast moving storms nonetheless in rough terrain. Let's pull another sounding here from closer to the warm front itself across west north Mississippi. And wow, a just absolutely curved photograph, although maybe a little bit influenced by convection. So let's pull one a little further away. And that's a lot cleaner. Still just barely enough instability to be buoyant at the surface. Um, Not a whole lot of instability, but if that instability can get in here, just enough, 500 to 1,000 joules, this would support a very robust QLCS tornado threat. We'll likely probably be seeing by this evening linear structures producing kinks in the line, and some of these can potentially be fairly strong given the orientation of the line itself. But yeah, that's a very impressive photograph if we can realize that instability. And we'll continue on here through the evening hours to 3Z, and we'll look here in eastern and northern Mississippi. Extremely contaminated sounding, so let's pull one a little further away. And we're probably going to struggle to find any soundings in here. Oh, okay. But again, marginal instability, extremely large photograph shape. Um, Probably a dwindling of the severe threat, but we're pretty far away from the actual line itself. So maintaining a QLCS tornado threat up here. Let's go a little further south and a little bit of convective influence here. So it's going to be kind of hard to get a real true sounding here. That's not too far away removed from the instability axis, but we're still just maintaining large SRH. And that seems to be the story through this whole thing, is that we're maintaining an unstable atmosphere in large wind shear. So it doesn't matter if the environment itself becomes more linear. I think we're going to end up seeing probably a lot of very fast moving brief tornadoes, some of which may be strong through this bow echo. And getting down here towards New Orleans, I expect not too much of a tornado threat. Yeah. The overall magnitude of the low level wind shear is really starting to flatten out. Photograph is becoming a little bit more straight overall, likely more of a large hail threat, less of a tornado threat over the New Orleans area overnight, which again, great news for this region, but it seems further north, the tornado threat still continues through the evening. Alrighty. So with that, that pretty much kind of ends the forecast briefing here. But I did want to just point out from a chaser's perspective, for those that are unfamiliar with the area, this is quite a difficult region to go storm chase. Our moderate risk zone, as we've discussed, sits a little bit more like this. And a lot of this is very rough terrain to chase in, the only saving grace being the delta itself. So for storm chasers, this seems fairly aligned with being able to try to catch some tornadoes, likely after dark here in the delta region, as trying to plow into these tree areas would likely lead to almost impossible viewing conditions, which would make chasing these storms, which are moving again at 40 to 50 miles an hour, hard to see before they're basically on top of you. So I think the safe play is to hang out in the delta itself, wait for that line of storms to come plow through, or wait for potentially any bubbling lead storms to try to move their way northward and try to catch them as they produce tornadoes, potentially tornadoes, as they move more northeast with time. So it's going to be a very interesting day. I think we have a day that can foster an all hazards threat. I think there is the potential for a few to potentially several strong to long track tornadoes, but I think it's going to be really riding that axis of where you have just enough instability combining with just enough SRH here. And I think from what we saw in the surface analysis, I think a lot of that maxed area for the greatest tornado threat will likely be, get a better color here, maximized in this region of the moderate risk, where you can get a combination of stronger wind shear on the northern side of that potential boundary, but also have enough of instability axis coming into the area, which would lead to probably a fairly robust tornado threat. So I think that wraps it up for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope this helps your chasing decisions if you're choosing to chase. Just some thoughts from my perspective. I think we've got a pretty robust day ahead. It'll be a pretty challenging day ahead to chase, as this is Dixie itself, and seems like we have an expansion of the moderate risk itself. So no high risk upgrade as of yet. So we maintain the 15% tornado hatch risk area. So overall, dangerous day ahead, potentially a few to many tornadoes, large hail and damaging winds. Be safe out there. Have fun for those out chasing, and look forward to seeing what you guys capture out there. Good luck.